Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this is Gingersnap. So welcome back to our living room for our Bible study series on the Deuterocanonical books of the Bible, otherwise known as the Apocryphal books, the extra bits that are in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but not necessarily in Protestant ones, unless you happen to be reading a giant hefty study Bible, such as, for example, this one. So, tonight I wanted to look at the story of Esther and the bonus chapters of Esther. So, Esther was one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible to be written, but what's particularly interesting about the book of Esther is that it is extremely unique in the entire Bible, that it literally never mentions or even references God ever at any point in the entire story. Like nobody prays, nobody worships, nobody's like, hey, I believe in God. It's not there at all, which is unusual. So there is another version of the story that was not written in Hebrew. Obviously, the Hebrew-speaking people of the Hebrew Bible wrote their stories down in Hebrew because it's what they spoke. But there's another version that only existed in Greek. So clearly it was written later because Bible stories written in Greek come from later. And it does add in some of the God stuff, which is really interesting. So, I did preach from the perspective of Esther in costume a couple years ago, and we also did a Bible study on it last year. So also this one has some really hard to pronounce names. So Ahasuerus. Anyway, we're going to go with Xerxes because I don't feel like stumbling over that anyway. So, once upon a time, and this is a historical fiction story, it's pretty generally regarded. There's a bunch of interesting stories about, or theories like academically, like why it was written, if it's like written to explain a holiday or some kind of cultural thing, if it's to kind of overwrite some of the names of the main characters are similar to names of Babylonian gods, and anyway, we don't know exactly why it was written, but it's a fun story regardless. So once upon a time, there's this king, and he's having this massive party, like literally 180-day straight party, just banquets and loads of drinking, and I'm not really sure how you, lead a country if you're having a 180-day long party, but whatever. I've never been a king, so this issue has never come up for me. Anyway, so he's a bit drunk. And so he asks for his wife, Queen Vashti, to come out and show her beauty to his guests. So many scholars read that as he's asking her to come out naked and present herself to his guests. So she's like, no. So naturally, the obvious response to this is to divorce her and send her away, as you do. He's not exactly a feminist icon. Anyway, so now he's in the market for another queen. So he has messengers sent out to the provinces, and they're like, okay, send me the prettiest young girl that you've got, and bring her to join my harem. So that's neat. Basically, it's a biblical premise for The Bachelor. So there's that, I guess. Anyway, among these women, it was Esther, otherwise known as Hadassah, which is her Hebrew name, but she's got two names because why not? Hebrew one anyway. So she is an orphan. She's been raised by her cousin, Mordecai. Oh, you're really purring. What a good cat. Anyway, so her cousin tells her, okay, so you're being summoned to the king's harem. Awkward. You probably shouldn't mention that you're Jewish, because that's not necessarily the safest identity to be having right now. So just keep it on the down low. So she does. Meanwhile, there's a little side story where Mordecai overhears some plot to like kill the king, and so he's like, "Hey, excuse me, king. These two guys, they were plotting to kill you." And the king's like, "Oh, well, shoot, I don't want that to happen. Thanks, Mordecai. I can avoid my death today." Anyway, so obviously Esther becomes queen because she wins the pretty contest. After spending a night with the king. So anyway, she's now queen, and her cousin saved the king's life, so cool. Meanwhile, there's this advisor guy, Haman, who's the villain of this story, and he is just super ticked off. Like one time, because he's like second in command to the king, people are supposed to like bow when they see him and be super respectful, but Mordecai doesn't bow to him because like he doesn't bow to people, he only bows to God, basically, and he's like, just how dare he? I hate this guy. How can I kill him? How can I kill anyone like him? Because obviously that's the reaction to have when somebody annoys you, is to try to have them killed. People really have just wonderful responses to things in this story. That was sarcasm. Okay, so Haman wants to kill off the Jews, which, yeah. So also a fun detail that he, to figure out exactly when the Jews should be killed, he draws lots, like shakes out some dice to get the most fortuitous date for the slaughter of a people. Yeah, actually, no date is the fortuitous date for killing people. It shouldn't. Anyway, I probably don't need to tell you that. Exactly, we don't kill people. That's right, Gingersnap. Yes, what a good cat. We just bite them and their computer charger cords. Yes, so Mordecai learns about this, and he's like, "Hey, Esther, so you're the queen, and your husband signed off on our execution. So maybe you could, like, have a chat with your husband and ask him to maybe, not kill us." But we've already seen that the first queen was sent off and dismissed and banished and divorced because she did something that the king didn't like. And so Esther has some pretty good reason to be a bit concerned that he might not even listen to anything that she has to say. And there's this rule, because the king is just really kind of full of himself, he has this rule that no one can come into his presence unless he has explicitly invited them. So she's like, okay, but if he doesn't ask to see me, and if he doesn't ask to see me before this date, then what do I do? So she fasts and prays, and she asks her cousin to fast and pray also. The prayer is not in the book, but it's said that she prays. And so then she goes to the king, even though she's not necessarily supposed to. And the king's like, "Oh, hey Esther, what's up?" She's like, "I have a favor to ask of you, my king, if you would oblige me." And he's like, "Yeah, sure, what is it?" "Well, I want you to come to a dinner party, you and Haman, tomorrow night. Come to a dinner party, and then I will tell you what it is that I want to ask of you." So he and Haman come to the dinner party, and so King's like, "Hey, what is it that you want to ask of me? You are my wife, even up to half of my kingdom, I will give it to you." She says, "For you to come to another dinner tomorrow, and I will make the request of you," which is really building up the suspense, which is a great literary element here. So meanwhile, in between these dinner parties, the king is having trouble sleeping, that one is pretty relatable. And so he doesn't exactly have access to sleeping pills or whatever. So he has someone read to him from the history of the kingdom, which I guess that would put you to sleep. Anyway, so the passage that the book happens to be flipped to is, hey, that time a couple chapters ago when Mordecai saved your life. He's like, "Oh yeah, that was a thing that happened. Did we ever actually thank him, or we didn't? Oh, we should do that." So the next morning, and meanwhile Haman, who again is a jerk and the villain of the story, has been plotting to kill Mordecai the whole time. He even has gone so far as to construct a stake in the courtyard of the castle on which to impale Mordecai. because he didn't bow to him one time. I mean, don't ever impale people on stakes, like, for any offense, but anyway. So Haman goes to the king, and he's like, hey, Haman, you're my top advisor guy. If I wanted to honor somebody for their service to me, how should I do that? So Haman, of course, assumes that the king is talking about him. He's like, oh, well, let's see, dress him up in the king's robes and have a big parade and have everybody just like shout like how amazing and wonderful this guy is, because he's just the coolest. Yeah, just heap praise on him in a big parade. So the king's like, yeah, that seems reasonable. Go set that up for Mordecai. And Haman is like, oh, poop. So Mordecai is not impaled on a stake that morning, suffice to say. So now they come to the dinner party again, and so the king's like, okay, so my wife, what is it that you wanted to ask of me? She's like, don't kill me. He's like, was that a concern that you had, that I was gonna kill you? She's like, yeah. You gave your approval to a decree to kill me and all of my people. He's like, was I drunk? I don't, when did I do that? And she's like, well, I'm Jewish. He's like, oh. And so she explains that Haman has been just plotting against her and her cousin and all of their people, and the king is rightfully furious. It's really kind of, in a large part, his fault for agreeing to this in the first place, or for having an advisor who was such a bloodthirsty, selfish jerk. But anyway, he blames it all on Haman. And so Haman gets killed instead. And so saves the day. He can't technically undo a decree that he has decreed. I feel like if you're the king, you can make a new rule that says you can change the rules, but whatever. It also probably would be hard to get the news out to everybody in time. So it's still scheduled in the kingdom calendar that all the Jews are going to be slaughtered, because that's a thing on your calendar, sure. But the Jews are given permission to defend themselves, and so the happy ending is that instead of the Jews being slaughtered, they have advance warning and go out and do the slaughtering themselves, and everybody lives happily ever after. This is kind of a weird story. So you can pull out themes of speaking up for the truth, even when it might cost you something. Which is a perfectly valid theme. That God will prevail, that it can be a very close call sometimes for people to be slaughtered. Like they came pretty close to it. And like this is a very dangerous world that we live in. They were really, really close, but the bravery of Esther and Mordecai did end up saving the day. And so individuals can have a big impact in the world if they speak up for what is right. But that maybe arguably is kind of pulling at some threads. When we retell stories, we sometimes add details. So it's kind of been a trend in the last couple years that like the classic animated Disney princess movies have been made into live action features, and they try to fix or address some of the plot holes in the original movies. And so in the live action Cinderella, there's a whole backstory for the evil stepmother, which I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And so they're kind of trying to fill in gaps and kind of make a more cohesive narrative. So when the Greek version retold this story, they were like, okay, so clearly this book like is missing some chapters, right? Because obviously the original version would have mentioned God, right? So they added in what they maybe thought would have been original, or what they thought like needed to be there. Like for a book to be in the Bible, maybe it should have some prayers in it, or like literally any reference to God, and kind of tones down the ending a bit also. So the additions to Esther are what is the apocryphal or deuterocanonical part of this story. And is almost as long as the original story itself, so like really does expand things. There's some prophetic dreams that come in, a few extra details, really goes off about the jewel-encrusted golden goblets at the party in the beginning, which is kind of neat, and just all the flowers, and it's cool. Just a few more details here and there. And then, let's see, more details when Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. Meow. Oh, yes. Oh, come here. I turned on the electric blanket to be like a cat magnet. That's where you're supposed to be hanging. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yes. Okay. So then we also have the text of the letters that the king is sending out. Oh, cat. Originally to slaughter the Jews, and then there's a letter later on to like revise that. So then there's a long prayer that Mordecai prays, which starts out, "O Lord, Lord, you rule as king over all things, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. You are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. You know all things. You know my situation. Do not forget me. Save my people." Prayer goes on. So then there's a prayer that Esther prays, which begins, "O my Lord, you only are our king. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand." I think it's kind of a neat touch that both of these prayers open by acknowledging the kingship of God when the story is about a king who holds their lives in his hands. So what is particularly dramatic about this retelling, so it's kind of odd that the king has this rule that nobody can enter his presence without like explicit invitation. And there is very clear precedence of having a queen divorced and dismissed and banished for not doing what he wants. And yet Esther just like shows up and the king's cool with this. So in the Greek version, it kind of explains that, so she's all dressed up in her jewels, and she has 2 maids with her, one of whom is carrying her train, and one of whom she's leaning on because she's been fasting for a couple days, and also she's freaking terrified because, the king might, like, have her banished. And so she gets to the doorway, and the king sees her, and the king's face flashes with anger, and she is so terrified that she faints. And then the king is overcome with, "Oh, my poor, beautiful young wife, who is fainting, I must take care of her." So he has her brought in, and he's like, why have you come to me? Are you okay? What can I do for you? You've been to half of my kingdom. And so she starts to ask, and then she faints again, which is very dramatic. And the fainting often comes up in art, which is interesting. This detail from the extra version, it's very dramatic. It's very dramatic, but it definitely does explain why Esther got away with it. Not in the original text, but it's all historical fiction anyway. So so then the dinner party, a few more details and a dialogue. Also, when I preached from the perspective of Esther, first person, a couple years ago, I did include some of the prayers and worked those into the narrative, all of which come from the extra chapters. That was kind of a fun little literary bonus. So then there is the letter that the king sends out to like write over the whole kill all of the Jews thing. And he's like, yeah, my advisor, turns out he sucks. So really, we shouldn't be killing people. But we find that the Jews, who were consigned to annihilation by this thrice accursed man, are not evildoers. No, they're not. Weird. But are governed by most righteous laws, and are children of the living God, most high, most mighty, who has directed the kingdom both for us and for our ancestors in the most excellent order. So clearly he's pretty cool with God now. So anyway, post a letter of this everywhere, and Jews have the right to defend themselves. So now it's not that the Jews are taking it upon themselves to slaughter their attackers or anyone who might attack them. It's just that they are defending themselves, which is a lot easier to read, to put it mildly. I'm pretty anti-slaughtering people. Maybe you didn't know that about me. So anyway, then this is established as a holiday. Bunch more hard to pronounce names. Also it's not just Haman who gets executed, but his whole household, including his 10 sons. So that's still an uncomfortable detail, but the different worldview a couple thousand years ago, sure. So anyway, then we established the festival of Purim, which comes from the word for lots, which is how they came upon the fortuitous date for the killing of all of the Jews. Anyway, so then it brings back to the prophetic dream that Mordecai had at the beginning of the Greek version of the story to kind of wrap things up. So, there is a book in our Bible that never mentions God. Although I think that the uniqueness of that aspect does kind of raise the question and make us ask, where is God in this story? And which is a good question to ask for many stories. But maybe you could look at it that way. It's up to you to see God's actions and God's involvement and presence throughout the story, and it's not just straight up telling you, except for in the Greek version where it does do that. So the Greek version of the story is kind of like the additional sections of Daniel that we read a few weeks ago, that kind of imagine how characters in the established story might have responded to something else. Maybe the question of if they're praying, what is their prayer? Which I think is a perfectly valid question. Whether that, later fan fiction should be published into the canonical version is its own question, but I think that it's interesting to read these two versions of the story side by side. Why were the changes that were made, and what does that tell us about how people believe, how people want the Bible to be about God, and how it definitely says things about their prayer life. And they aren't lovely prayers. It's both versions are a very good story, very action-packed, and obviously there's been a bunch of movies in addition to the art and etc. Anyway, so the Greek version is not canonical in our tradition, but is still fun to read. So we have another Deuterocanonical apocryphal story next week, which I am legitimately very disappointed is not in our Bible. It's a great one. Stay tuned. Tune in next week. And then we might get into some of the other, not technically in our Bible, stories that get real weird. And yet still very, very, very much influence how we see the stories in the Gospel, despite very definitively not being in the Bible. Anyway, we'll get there. Anyway, so in the meanwhile, excuse me, Gingersnap. I know you were all sprawled out across the warm blanket, but we're going to say goodnight to our friends now. Yeah, say goodnight to the people. Until next time.